Alex? What are they talking about now?
Yeah,
Wait,
tell me
click.
what's going on.
Hang on. And we're live. It is Wednesday, January 13th, 2021, 5:02 p.m. Donald Trump has been impeached again, making him the first president in history to not be able to tweet a reaction to his second impeachment. I suspect this is a distinction kind of like Joe DiMaggio's 56-game hitting streak that is just like never gonna be beaten. But he has had no social media response. And actually the response on Parler to Donald Trump's impeachment has been really muted because Parler isn't there. And so, right now the response, I'm looking at Parler right now, and it says the site cannot be reached. DNS probe finished, NX domain. So
Brian is here.
Brian is here. We're going to invite him in while I continue spouting inanities. That's, I think, the really important point is that 10 Republicans and Twitter voted against the president today. So now he, heads to the Senate where he won't be able to communicate on Facebook about it either. All right. We are not allowed to have fun anymore. But in lieu of fun, we are allowed to talk about alternatives to impeachment, including Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, which has probably one of the least discussed provisions of the Constitution until 2 days ago, when, or 3 days ago, when all of a sudden, seemingly in unison, a large number of people remembered that it existed, and two of whom are with us today, Deepak Gupta and Brian Beutler. And so you guys wrote an op-ed. There's been several op-eds about it. Most of them, Bruce Ackerman's and his colleagues sort of said, do it instead of impeachment. Yeah. You guys took a more modest position, which is that the powers are complementary and they play a different role from each other. So first of all, Brian, get us started. Walk us through your argument. Why is impeachment alone not good enough, even if the president can't tweet about it? And why should we be doing this in addition?
I'd say a couple reasons. One is a bit of a long shot, admittedly, but I think that the 14th Amendment sort of works as a lever against the any wish that Senate Republicans might have that they can escape a vote on Trump's culpability simply by running out the clock on his term and then hoping that Democrats, with Trump gone, say we just want to focus on our agenda and maybe let's leave this unpleasantness behind us. It's a means by which Democrats, through the normal legislative process, can hold an accountability vote on Trump's eligibility to hold office again, even if he's no longer president. And so the removal power is sort of moot. And then secondly, it is just more expansive. It applies to more people. And so whether now or in the coming weeks and months, as we learn more about what happened last week and who's culpable for it, the ranks of people you can disqualify from public office in the future will grow. And it'll be up to the Congress to decide whether they want to go on the record as saying that these individuals who participated in the insurrection and themselves have already betrayed their oath of office by doing it, should thus be disqualified from future office. And our argument is that if Congress takes an affirmative position on that yes, they should be disqualified, that it'll make that provision more easily enforced by courts and by election officials.
All right. That is a extremely compelling argument with some very radical implications. I want to bracket the radical implications for a minute because I want to come back and really play with them. But before we do that, Deepak, walk us through Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. When people think of the 14th Amendment, they think birthright citizenship, they think the Equal Protection Clause, right? They think Brown v. Board of Ed. They don't think disqualification from office of state and, elected office and honor and trust under the Constitution. So what is Section 3? What does it do? And how has it been used in the past?
Yeah, and the reason people don't talk about this amendment much is it's kind of like it's a historical curiosity. It was very important in the period right after the Civil War, and then basically went into disuse with one small exception that we can talk about. I had been reading Eric Foner's great book called The Second Founding, which is a book about the history. Of course, he's known as a Reconstruction historian, but it's about the history of these amendments. So I kind of maybe had it in the back of my mind. And then on Wednesday, when the insurrection was happening, it came to me that this there's an amendment that's actually about insurrection. I'm just going to read it to everyone so people know what it says. Because the text is, just listen to this text and you'll see that it's amazingly applicable to the current moment. No person shall be a senator or representative in Congress or elector of president and vice president or hold any office, civil or military, under the United States or under any state who, having previously taken an oath as a member of Congress or an officer of the United States, that includes the president, or as a member of any state legislature or an executive or judicial official of any state to support the Constitution of the United States, shall have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the same, meaning against the Constitution of the United States, or given aid or comfort to the enemies thereof. In other words, look, if you swore an oath to defend the Constitution of the United States when you took an office under the U.S. government, and then you betrayed that oath, you betrayed the Constitution by participating. Now, what they had in mind is the insurrection and rebellion of the Civil War. You fought for the Confederacy. You only got one chance, and you betrayed that oath, and we're not going to let you serve in the United States government. So the reason we don't talk about this amendment that much is because it's largely seen as backwards looking. It's largely seen as focused on fighting in the Confederacy. But if you look at the drafting history of this amendment, you see that at first it had language that was really just focused on the Civil War and the Confederacy, and the drafters chose broader language, have engaged in an insurrection or rebellion that has a prospective effect. And I think that, there was a recognition that there could be other insurrections, just like today after what happened on Wednesday. I think we all are living in fear that there could be other insurrections on state capitals or other rebellions. It happens once, you're afraid it'll happen again. And so this provision has been sitting there waiting for an insurrection or rebellion. I'm sure we'll get into talking about what that is. But once you conclude that what happened is an insurrection within the meaning of the Constitution, it's incredibly on point, right? We're concerned about these people who have violated their oath to defend the Constitution. They committed an assault on a sacred constitutional process, the peaceful transition of power, the seat of our government. And what we're concerned about is, whether Donald Trump and others who took that oath should be allowed to serve again. So, it was interesting to me on Wednesday, immediately everyone started tweeting and talking about the 25th Amendment and the impeachment clause. But it seemed to me this provision should be more applicable. So I tweeted about this, and within a very short amount of time, I started hearing from staffers over on the Hill, people in the Senate Judiciary Committee.
It's getting a lot of concentrated attention on the Hill.
Right. Yeah. But I'm talking within 24 hours of the insurrection. And so, Brian and I started talking about it over the weekend and decided to do this op-ed. And I think already by Saturday and Sunday, I mean, these shell-shocked members of Congress and staffers were all trying to figure out what to do. And a dynamic had already started where there were some people, Republicans and even some Democrats, who were thinking about Section 3 of the 14th Amendment as an alternative. Things have changed a lot in the last few days, but on Saturday, it still wasn't clear whether you were going to get even all the Democrats on board on impeachment, let alone some Republicans. And so some folks were pushing back and saying, we shouldn't consider this amendment. And I think the point that Brian and I wanted to make is, why does it have to be either or? These are different constitutional provisions. They set up different processes. They reach, as Brian mentioned, a different range of cases. And why can't we have both?
So I have like, the thing about this that strikes me is really, I agree with you that like looking at everything you point out in the article is excellent. I'll actually drop a link to the op-ed. I don't think we've done that yet into the chat. And I think you made a really smooth, compelling argument. I agree with you about the drafting, about it being more prescriptive than kind of just the Civil War. But what really does seem difficult to me is the idea that this is like, that, as you said, the idea of this having to come together through legislation. And in the, like, what I don't understand there is like politically, how does a vote over legislation end up so different in such a different place? Like if they were to do this, how does that end up in a different place than say a vote on impeachment? Right.
So, well, the Constitution says that to remove the president, you need 2/3, right?
Right. Yep.
For legislation, the Constitution doesn't say you need anything more than a majority.
Right.
The Senate's rules, at least right now, say you need to survive a filibuster. Maybe that will change. And then it's a little bit, there's some constitutional doubt, about whether you can have a trial, an impeachment trial after somebody has left office. And then if you do, what vote threshold applies to that. But I think the best reading of the Constitution is you still need 2/3 to convict in the Senate, even if you need a lower threshold for the remedy of disqualification. So,
okay,
but I think the thing we were worried about is,
go ahead.
One thing that worries me about the impeachment and then doing that as a substitute for the 14th Amendment remedies, or vice versa, is you could end up in a situation where 2/3 minus 1 senators think he should be convicted, but he's already out of office. And because they acquitted him, you never reach the disqualification vote. It's a way of saying, look, like the three, prongs of accountability for the impeachment process are putting members of Congress on the record, removing the president, and then disqualifying him. The calendar and Mitch McConnell are sort of conniving to spare Donald Trump the middle prong of accountability, but we have a way, we think, of preserving the other two, and that's the goal.
Yeah. Also, I mean, just, this is, you can think of it as a plan B. You think of it like, Donald Trump is acquitted. This option is still available. It also, allows for broad perspective legislation that goes beyond Trump. I think we lost Kate, huh? She's having
She'll be back.
Yeah. So, a lot of people are thinking about, what about these legislators who participated in inciting or organizing this insurrection? What about these, like former or current, military or law enforcement officials, all sorts of people? There was a sitting West Virginia state legislator who was among the mob that actually went into the building. So all of those people are people who took oaths to defend the Constitution of the United States. And another point that Brian and I are making in the piece is, we should be really concerned about the implications of allowing those people, after what just happened, to continue to serve in office. Imagine that one of these people goes back to their deep red district and says, I was a hero of the insurrection. You should send me to Congress. That's not something we can allow.
Well, it is something we have allowed in the past, actually. I mean, whether we call it insurrection or not. So I want to walk through a couple of aspects of this that are complicated in a way that we've thought through a lot of aspects of impeachment, but haven't thought through, aspects of this, at least in the modern era. The first is there any good law on what an insurrection is within the meaning of Section 3?
Yeah.
Because I could see an argument. There's a very good common sense argument that what happened January 6th, where you're literally assaulting the seat of government, is kind of your textbook definition of insurrection. But I could also see an argument that the original understanding of this is very much about a state that declares its secession. You ally yourself with the seceding state. You levy war against the Army of the United States, right? Or the Army of the Potomac, as we no longer call the U.S. military. And that there is a kind of, in the context of the 14th Amendment, there's a kind of a term of art quality to the term insurrection, and it is very backward looking. And so I guess my first question is, why are you confident that a court looking at keep this asshole off the ballot, he's covered by this law, doesn't take one look at the word insurrection and say, sorry, I'm going to get to all of you who don't do constitutional law, I'm going to get technical for a second, in a city of Bernie kind of way. Hey, I know that, we're supposed to defer to you and all that, but at the end of the day, this is text and we get to decide what it means. And insurrection has a very Civil War inflected meaning. Actually seems to me more probable than not that you've got 3 votes on the Supreme Court for that walking in. Do you buy it?
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's set aside the realpolitik of counting votes, and let's just talk about this as law as if there are right answers in the law. Okay.
How naive.
For the people who are not lawyers, who don't know what city of Bernie is, basically the idea is, and this goes back to Marbury versus Madison, the court decides what the Constitution means. Congress doesn't get to decide for it, and Congress can't sort of, load the dice by forcing the court's hand, or whatever metaphor you want to use. So I was initially skeptical, because I had never considered what the original understanding or reach of these words were. And that's why when I tweeted this out on the night of the insurrection, I wasn't ready to make any kind of argument. I wanted to look. And so first of all, what's amazing, and Kate and I were DMing about this, amazing timing. There's a law student who wrote a piece that explores the original understanding of these words.
Wow.
That's
a good student note.
I'll drop a link to it. It's insane. I don't want to blow up.
He was in the Trump White House.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yes. You told me that.
I told you
that's too delicious to be.
And he actually, I think, had Black Lives Matter protesters in mind. Which gets to, Ben's concern.
I found it. Okay, great. His name is Miles Lynch.
Oh God.
Yeah, that's an unfortunate name.
Let me try to. So Ben,
I've heard from people who've had him in class, and that he's lovely, and he worked hard on this paper and was working on it beforehand. But yes, maybe had Black Lives Matter in mind. I didn't hear that, but
I feel really bad for him because he's clerking for a judge right now, so he can't talk to anyone about this.
Yes, exactly.
For a law student or legal scholler to write something,
fucking nightmare.
It's relevant and not be able to talk to anyone. It's sad.
Yeah, it hurts.
But so these words, insurrection or rebellion, it's true. They were used in the Militia Act of 1795, which was the predecessor for the Insurrection Act, and that's what you're describing, Ben. But they go back even further. They go back. They were common law concepts in English law. And check this out.
They show up in the habeas clause.
Yeah.
But not rebellion, but insurrection.
Right. But so in England in the 1780s, there was actually a riot, a mob that attacked Parliament. And there was a trial for the predecessor equivalent of this concept of insurrection or rebellion. And so some of the early American cases, which I think the framers, you have to imagine they looked at when they were choosing this language, said that, sort of a classic example of what's covered by this language is it's a pretty high bar, but if you've got a group of people acting in combination is the word it uses, and they impede the execution of the law or the like a legislative process to such an extent that the civil authorities cannot manage that violence and lawful processes are impeded, and so that they have to resort to the protection of military force. All of those things are satisfied by what happened on Wednesday. I mean, these people had the aim of obstructing what the legislature was doing. They succeeded in doing that with force. That doesn't happen. I can't think of other examples where that happens.
Well, but it's kind of elegant. It's kind of elegant that the example that you cite is an example of a mob attacking Parliament, giving rise to this language, rather than a formally declared state of rebellion against the crown or
something, or like some type of military insurrection or walkout or anything like that. Like it's the public against Congress.
And I know we can't know how much this will affect how judges interpret the meaning. Maybe they'll only resort to the history that Deepak's reading from now. But to me, it's telling that even some Trump-aligned members of Congress and leaders are referring to it as an insurrection. It was against their own body, and that's how they interpret it.
Well, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, referred to it as an insurrection. And so you can say, I think the best argument on your all's side of this would be, in every colloquial modern sense, it is an insurrection. In the formal military sense, literally the Joint Chiefs referred to it as an insurrectionary activity. And by the way, it's consistent with the original understanding of the language in the relevant statutes. So I think that's pretty strong, actually.
But go ahead. Sorry.
No, sorry, Deepak. You finish up, and then I want to just kind of unpack.
Oh yeah. Okay.
A little bit some of this.
Just one other data point is that I think the drafters were definitely thinking about treason trials, and you had the treason trial of Aaron Burr, and then also the treason trial of Jefferson Davis, where the arguments track these concepts that we're talking about. And so it's there's not a lot of case law, but there is some, and I was surprised to see how well it fits this situation.
So, okay, I apologize if this came up and was addressed when I blipped out for a second, but let's just talk about kind of definitions in the law and just, there's something about teaching 1Ls or something that makes me kind of me feel kind of like if it just seems this easy, especially when, that we found this provision that we're going to go, that we haven't used it before. It's both the original text, the legislative history, and kind of the modern understanding. And Ben said even the military called it that. Although if I was arguing against this, I would say that basically the military repeating this wasn't an endorsement of a military definition, but rather just more civilian more modern day usage than the military. But all of this kind of hinges on this idea that there's some type of sense out of that is and consistency out of interpreting the words in the Constitution. And I'm sorry to be so legally realist about this, but there isn't always, like, it doesn't, like, for instance, like, there are lots of things that I think Congress should be able to do under, like, the Privileges and Immunities Act that are foreclosed because of, or Privileges and Immunity Clause, but are foreclosed because that was, that was what the Supreme Court said 100 years ago. I just think that there needs to be, like, I just kind of, like, all of this seems really great when we're sitting in armchairs talking about this. Courts hate this type of stuff. Like, they don't want to be the first one to, like.
So how much law is there on this?
Totally. I think you're totally right, and I think this just hits on a point that Brian mentioned earlier. This is why we feel strongly that Congress should write legislation. Because imagine that you're you're a state trial judge a few years from now in an election contest, okay? And you're trying to figure out whether Mo Brooks or whoever should be on the ballot. And some lawyers come into your courtroom and you've got like divorces and criminal cases and other stuff. And they're like, let me take you through the English, common law back to the, it doesn't.
Yeah. What I would do if I was clerk? I'd be like, well, let me find a nice way that, like, there's like latches, like, forecloses this argument or something.
So now let me give you a different hypothetical. You're that exact same judge, except Congress has passed a statute. The legislative history has a detailed explanation of the history of this, and that Congress is legislating against the backdrop of that. They create a cause of action. They create a set of procedures. They define the standard of conduct. They say, here's what insurrection or rebellion means. So you get to apply that. So these are all the reasons why Brian and I think, like, Congress should actually do something, and that it's not, I'm sure even if Congress does nothing, there's going to be litigation under the Constitution.
I have no doubt about that.
Sorry,
Brian, go ahead.
I also just don't think that the term insurrection is as capacious as privileges and immunities or any of the other terms that people like Randy Barnett or whatever try to imbue with dramatic meaning that's completely at odds with our lived experience of government in the United States. If we're wrong that this isn't an insurrection, we're not that wrong. It's like, right?
It's definitely a close question.
I mean,
here's a question that may be a little less. Here's a question that may be a little less close. I'm going to paste in the relevant language about what the individual has to have done, which is shall have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the same, or given aid or comfort to the enemies thereof.
Yeah.
Now, I am thinking that I am now, let's imagine that Donald Trump gets acquitted by the Senate, which I think we all in our hearts kind of suspect is going to happen. 65 senators vote to convict, not 67, and he sends out a press release because he can't tweet saying cleared again. Thank God Almighty, I'm cleared again. And he immediately declares his candidacy for president. And so there is a litigation either under the statute that you're describing or just under the text of the Constitution that says keep him off the ballot because he's ineligible. And he says, wait a minute, I did not engage in any insurrection. I made a speech to a peaceful crowd.
Yeah.
Which was at the time that I gave the speech, it was a peaceful crowd. And I did not urge them to engage in any act of violence. I urged them to march to Congress and express themselves, as is their First Amendment right. And then I went away, and they went and did some bad things, and I told them to go home.
Yeah.
I told them I loved them and that I should go home. In what sense have I engaged in the insurrection or given aid and comfort to it, unless you mean that I said that I loved people, which I love all of my fellow human beings. I am dripping with the warmth of human kindness.
Oh my God, Ben, you're like making my skin crawl, like imagining. I mean, like, I know that this is like in the realm of
This is exactly what they're going to argue.
Yeah, no, it's exactly
and
what
so my question is, why does it fail?
Okay, so I have to say, I had the same thought when I looked at the words. I thought, okay, well, engage might cover just the riffraff who went into the building. Until I started looking at the law under the predecessor statutes and the common law. And the reason is this, that it's clear that the framers and the common law concepts don't just pick up the people who actually carry out the orders. They pick out the people who give the orders too, the people who incite the mob. Lord Gordon, who was tried in that riot, he was just inciting the mob. He was speaking to the mob. He wasn't, he was a lord. So I think that fits with the history of the provision. And also, if you think about what, the framers of that provision were trying to do, they cared more about the Confederate generals and the Confederate politicians than they did about the foot soldiers.
But the generals participated.
Right. So we don't know. I mean, I think
what's the
part of it turns on the fact. So we need to know exactly what Trump's role was and the role of many of these other people. And I think we're going to find out more. Another virtue of the proposal.
See, I think Josh Hawley, who raised his fist, by the way, somebody needs to educate Josh Hawley. The raised fist is a Black Power and socialist symbol. He really shouldn't be using symbols
You don't think that's
of
what
socialism.
He was invoking, Ben?
But
I think he didn't know. He's a little confused.
But Ben,
that's giving Aiden comfort.
We're going to learn a lot of facts. I mean, the facts are coming out so quickly now, and it does seem like there were calls to and from the White House. It seems like there was direction, there was organization.
I wanted to see if there was money. There was
money.
There's reporting to the effect that Trump was the impediment to calling out the National Guard. And by the time we get around to passing this legislation, if Congress follows the advice we've laid out, there's going to be so much more known about his specific role, but also the roles of the people that he installed at the Department of Defense, his chief of staff, members of Congress on the Hill. So the fact finding will inform the legislation, and it'll be so much more developed by the time we get there. That if Congress decides, look, we think it's too close a call to disqualify Trump, but these other 8 people were clearly involved, even if they didn't storm the Capitol, that's how it shakes out. But
so
I think
what if he put them up in the Trump Tower or something, or in the Trump Hotel? They come on some Third Amendment thing or something. I don't know. Also, that. Okay.
So who's the person that you guys look at and you say, and Brian, your point that the facts actually will matter in how you craft the statute is a really good one that I want to. But who's the person who you look at and your instinct is the properly crafted statute will actually preclude their future service?
So,
based on what we know right now, go ahead, Deepak.
Lots of people, most people. So first of all, the statute can only constitutionally apply to people who have already taken oaths of office. So most of the people who participated in the mob are excluded. Then it's not going to reach people who engaged in, purely peaceful protest. If they were just engaged in First Amendment activity, if they didn't go up to the building and try to obstruct it or direct or incite people to do so. And I think, maybe we can get into the concern you raised at the outset, because it's a big concern. It's one I have. The First Amendment protects dissent. It protects unruly dissent. It protects my right to go to a protest that ends up, unbeknownst to me, to become violent. It protects my right to speak at a protest that ends up being violent. And so we don't want a rule that sweeps in or even chills that kind of activity. And that's why I went through the litany of the things that were so unique about this event that track the traditional definition of insurrection. I mean, this is a scenario in which the president would have been justified in issuing a proclamation under the Insurrection Act. And he didn't. Obviously, we shouldn't insist that there be a presidential proclamation in the situation, but that's how unique it is. That's how high a bar it is, and it should be, because it would be a really dangerous weapon otherwise, right? We would not want a situation in which the Constitution or the laws of the United States can be used to go after political opponents and bar them from office. That is not what we're talking about here.
And I think you already see members of Congress kind of naturally, whether they've dwelled on this question or not, making a distinction between the 140, whatever it was, House Republicans and 7 senators who voted to essentially overturn the election, and talking about them in different terms. This is sedition, or this is, just shitty behavior. And maybe the remedy for them is expulsion from Congress, which has a very high bar to clear, versus the people who actively encouraged rioters to descend on the Capitol, who maybe helped them navigate the Capitol. There was one new member of Congress who tweeted about Nancy Pelosi being removed from the House chamber. And then obviously there's the question of to what extent any effort to repel the insurrection was intentionally sabotaged within the executive branch. And so that leaves you with, I don't know what the number will be, but it's not the 140 people who voted against certifying Arizona or whatever. It's a much smaller universe of people, and it's hard to know who will be the clearest, who this law would apply to most clearly and plainly.
Well, I think there's one guy, the West Virginia guy, right? I mean, that guy is
sure.
Like,
yeah, that's a good.
You can't deny that person.
He already, and I think he already.
Hold on, say more.
Resigned.
Oh, so this is a dude who was elected to the West Virginia state legislature and was actually in the mob who stormed the building.
Oh, I hadn't heard about that.
Yeah.
And I believe he's already resigned. So, I mean,
he had resigned. If he had not resigned, he would have been our perfect test, right?
Yeah.
Another thing I think we want to emphasize is we're not suggesting that Congress enumerate, who these people are or anything in legislation. We do not, because there's this concept for the non-lawyers, a bill of attainder, right? You can't constitutionally single out particular people and deprive them of due process. And that's why what we're suggesting is you pass a law, the law gets applied by courts, people get their due process, the facts are developed. That's how it should work.
Although I actually think this provision is arguably, it postdates the Bill of Attainder clause. It supersedes it to the extent they conflict.
Right.
And I think it does contemplate Congress kind of naming individuals and saying, Robert E. Lee doesn't get to run for office.
I mean, Deepak,
Jefferson
this could
Davis.
be part of the legislative history for sure.
Yeah, and actually there is history about this. Was litigated in the post-Civil War period about whether it was a Bill of Attainder. And that argument was made, but I think the best way to steer clear of constitutional concern would be to write something that seems generally applicable and prospective. Some people are proposing you do both. Our op-ed proposes that you write this general legislation, but then Congress can also pass resolutions that express the sense of Congress based on the known evidence that particular people would run afoul of the disqualification provision, and then a court gets to decide what it wants to make of that. I think in the real world, courts are going to defer quite a lot, and we're going to have some special committee on. We might have many committees. I mean, there needs to be a lot of investigation of what just happened. But when we have that 9/11 style commission report, I think that courts are going to defer very much to those findings.
So I want to go ahead, Ben. You're muted.
Oh.
So Brian, let's turn to kind of the political viability of this. What's got to happen to make this happen? Where's the best place to start? And is it? I mean, I think it's too early to ask whether this is likely or not because of what you said before about facts that are still coming. But also, I just think people are not. Well, I mostly think it's about kind of seeing how facts come out and what happens with impeachment. And things are just the chips are still falling. Mm-hmm. So what are your thoughts?
So the way I would do it if I led either the House or Senate Democratic caucus is very early after inauguration, introduce legislation, essentially just saying in general terms, individuals found to have participated in this insurrection are in violation of 14th Amendment Section 3 and are disqualified from public office. And then you separate, in one or a series of future votes, whether it's to ratify the terms of the commission report or just a sense of Congress resolution or a censure resolution, as the facts develop, you can actually continuously update who is in the eyes of Congress culpable enough that they should be disqualified, and that way you don't have to do any sort of lengthy process. Assuming the filibuster applies to the legislation that you would introduce right away, you need 60 votes for it in the Senate, and so it's kind of an open question to me whether you can get it. If I were Senate Democrats, I would play some sort of procedural hardball with that bill, either say as a unique bill contemplated in the Constitution, and there's no filibuster in the Constitution, we're going to just set a new precedent and say there's no filibuster on this bill, and then pass it with 50 votes. And then the House, it should be straightforward in the House. Every single Democrat just voted to impeach Trump for the second time. They're very pissed about what happened. My concern watching Democratic leaders respond in real time to the insurrection, their instinct was to adjourn. It was to sort of turn the page and say, and kind of imagine that there was just some vandalism, and let's not let this cloud where we're going, which is a new president and a progressive agenda, and we don't want to get bogged down in the messiness of accountability for this thing. And so I think that if you could force a vote on that bill, it would pass. I think to the extent that the question of what gets voted on is determined by those leaders, I have my concerns about whether they will decide, okay, we did the impeachment, it was what it was. We don't want to make Joe Biden's presidency be defined by what happened on January 6th, and make that sort of this perpetual thing that he's constantly associated with, as opposed to the proactive things he's doing to help the country, and that there will be an aversion to letting Congress vote on the bill and the subsequent measures. But I think that it would pass if it got a vote. I can't think of a single Democrat who would want to vote to say that wasn't an insurrection, or that people shouldn't be disqualified for it. And if you give it a vote, the politics will just take care of itself.
Yeah. So that kind of, go ahead, Ben. Oh no, you're muted.
I could also see realpolitik on the Republican side of the aisle. I could also see some realpolitik on the Republican side of the aisle, compelling some Senate Republicans, either the ones who don't want Donald Trump to be in the next Republican primary, or ones who just want him to be gone, and the Republican Party to sort of be able to make a clean break from the Trump era, deciding it's one vote, it's going to pass anyway. Why not just attach my name to it? And so that it kind of takes on a life of its own, and it passes pretty overwhelmingly. I don't know, but I don't think that's out of the realm of possibility.
I'll just say, I don't want to name names or anything, but I've been talking to a lot of people on the Hill, members, both on the House and Senate side about this, and I've talked to some Republicans even, and there's a lot of interest in doing this. I think it will be introduced. I think it will happen, and I think I'm not the politics expert here, but I think Brian is right. If it comes to the floor, this would pass. And so certainly,
and I think that we shouldn't underestimate the possibility that Donald Trump Jr. will support it to disqualify his father and his sister from running for president in the next election.
Well, you joke, but have you seen the predicted market for whether or not there is a predicted market for Pence's announcing a run by the end of 2022, and it went up 32 cents. I
didn't know that. No.
And the last week, no, of course, because of I just want to really quickly kind of add and let you guys answer really quickly. Just talk, if you could just talk a little bit, because we're talking about Brian, you mentioned there's this push of like, okay, let's just turn the page and put this behind us and move on. And you guys are there in DC. You're kind of living through this insane moment in history. And like, what has it been like for the last week? And do you see, both in your capacity and your expertise, but also as residents of the city, do you see us like, well, how do you see us being able to kind of move past this and keep and go forward? Do you think that there's anything to this idea of putting things to the side?
We will never totally move past it. We will never forget this. We are all changed by this forever. And I think, like, I don't know, I'm hearing an echo. I think, this summer was also just, it feels like a long time ago, but, this city was overtaken by federal forces that, from Bill Barr's army, he called it, right? That were put together in a just an overreaction to what were largely peaceful protests. We were kind of traumatized by that. There were helicopters everywhere. The city felt really under siege in a way that didn't feel rational or called for. And then I think all of us, like, when we saw this happening, we're just kind of enraged that what is happening? Why is this being allowed to happen? And I mean, we still don't understand, exactly what happened. But I think the whole city is traumatized. Certainly, anyone who works on the Hill in politics is traumatized by this. And yeah, I think this is, I don't know. I mean, this whole 4 years has felt like, we feel like what it means to live through a really fraught historical period, where you're very conscious of that on a regular basis. But this feels, it feels different. It feels like this is the turning point. This is the defining moment of the Trump era. This will be in all the history books.
Yeah,
I have a sort of comparator, and it's one that I think many Republicans and the Democrats whose instinct was to try to move on from this just didn't appreciate in the sort of fog of war. Like DC is like most cities, most people spend all their time at home right now because there's a pandemic, and so to some extent, I just watch this on TV like anyone else anywhere else in the country did. But in better times when there was no pandemic and I would go report on the Hill, like upon the passage of the Affordable Care Act, those were raucous protests. I mean, the foyers of the congressional office buildings were completely packed. People were screaming vulgarities and pejoratives at members of Congress. I was concerned that violence would break out, not necessarily in the buildings, but on the Capitol grounds. And we moved on from that fairly quickly. I mean, obviously the system continued to squabble over the Affordable Care Act for a long time, but the protests themselves didn't have make such a huge imprint on the national psyche. This was, in some sense, it was a very raucous crowd, and they got into the Capitol, but then people died, and there's video footage of a woman being shot and bleeding out right outside of the speaker's lobby, where reporters enter and exit to talk to members of Congress. And even though I was trapped in my house, that's where I used to do my reporting. And so it has this psychological effect on all of us, even those of us who weren't on hand to watch it happen, that this was very radically different from any of the most sort of raucous First Amendment actions that we've seen happen on Capitol Hill. And so the reporters aren't going to get over it easily. A lot of the members of Congress who occupy that space we're having panic attacks and are experiencing PTSD symptoms. It's just not feasible, I don't think, even if the political leaders of the Democratic Party want the Biden narrative to be defined by good feelings and a higher minimum wage or whatever else, to convince everyone else to just forget that cardinal difference between it and everything that came before it.
Yeah, I just to foot stomp that. I think people who don't live in DC or work in DC do not fully understand the trauma of the last 4 years for those of us who do. Mm-hmm. So I have not pre-consulted with either of our guests on this, but I'm going to just say it and you'll see them nodding and smiling. So there's this unwritten code DC is a 91, 92% Democratic jurisdiction. And that means when you meet a stranger in DC, there is an unspoken understanding, unless they're, dressed like a Republican, right? Like, and you're in certain
Dressed
bars
like a Republican.
around. No, it means something. It
I
means
know.
you're like at a particular club on Capitol Hill. There's only
Unless
certain
I'm at
neighborhoods.
Bedstock or something.
Yeah. Right. Like, unless
Right.
you're, but if you like get into a cab or into an Uber, you don't even have to, like, you just get to make the assumption that that person is roughly as disgusted with the current environment as you are. And, and people,
That's right.
people don't even pause to, like, and it is a feeling of being under occupation, such that when the Biden victory was declared, the streets around downtown, people just turned out spontaneously in very large numbers. And like, I drove down there just to sort of watch, and, people were literally dancing on my car. And nobody asked permission to dance on anybody's car, and nobody like got upset. That's the mood of this city. And so when something like this happens in that environment, it's it's definitely an us against them feeling of, this is an outside invasion force that came in to attack our black churches, beat up gay people on the streets, which they did a fair bit of on December 14th, 12th, and like, but there's like almost nobody in DC who doesn't think of this as like an outside invasion force. And I think that's different from, for example, Portland, Oregon, where there's a sort of local community of people who are kind of Proud Boys there. There's no local Proud Boys in Washington. Like there's, this is all people driving in very large numbers. And and so there's a, I would say, town gown quality to it, except it's, town, I don't know, occupying violent force thing. Anne Kornhauser, the floor is yours. Anne is our resident audience post-Civil War historian.
I can do that. Hi, thank you so much for coming in for your really interesting piece. So yes, former phoner doctoral student here, also a long time ago.
Awesome.
And have the book. And so let me just read you a sentence. Section 3, had more to do with who would exercise political power in the South than with punishing treason. So my question is, and I think this will be less problematic with legislation, but if you want to go to original understanding, and and that's not just a conservative conceit, although it's largely that. I think, as you probably know, both of you, the big concern was power over, federal power over the southern states and their insurrectionist ilk.
Yeah.
So it's yeah.
Of course, but those were the only states that had seceded and committed that rebellion. So it's natural that was the focus of the members of this is what's so hard about discerning, the original intent of a group of people, right? And so I don't think that's the right way to do it. I think even if Antonin Scalia were here, he would agree with me. That's not the right way to do it. Instead, you're trying to figure out, what did these words mean to lawyers at the time? What would it have meant? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Also,
I would just say, I think it's more of a federalism issue. It was. It doesn't mean it still has to be. The 14th Amendment is loaded with this issue. It's why some even lefty liberal constitutional scholars think Brown was problematic, right? Because anyway, it was about power over states.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Also, I'd be curious to hear Deepak talk.
Yeah, please.
Talk a little bit about the omission of the word state. Oh
yeah.
That if Congress, in ratifying this, wanted to talk about states rebelling against the federal government, they could have, and at the time you would expect that they would have, and they used a more general term, and I feel like that tells us something about how broadly they intended this to apply to any future action.
And not only that, but they chose federal offices, to trigger the provision, right? And federal offices to be covered by the disqualification. And Eric Foner, has said he basically he agrees with our position, and he thinks Congress should act.
All right, Mike Godwin, you get the last question tonight, which is to say the second question. Sorry to everybody who we only got to 2 questions tonight, but I can't
to talk about.
2 more appropriate people to ask them. Godwin, what's on your mind?
So my question, do I get to read my poem? No, maybe not. But is there any sense in which how do we understand Section 3 of Amendment 14 as being self-executing? The reason I ask that is, as you know, for the Fourth Amendment has the Wiretap Act and other provisions that protect constitutional values there. The First Amendment has different provisions in the U.S. Code that are designed to reinforce First Amendment rights. When I look through Title 18, in particular, you see 18 U.S.C. 2383, which bars federal office, 2384, which outlaws sedition. I think the scope of Section 3 is broader than both of those statutes taken together. So what I'm wondering is, what procedurally do you have to pass a law to somehow reach, the actors we would want to reach to bar from future office, or could we, exactly what does that look like legislatively?
Yeah, great question. So this was actually debated in the post-Civil War period. Was this self-executing? And one of the Supreme Court justices writing circuit said, no, it's not self-executing, and so somebody was acquitted, of a 14th Amendment violation. That's not really how we think about the Constitution these days. We don't, we think that pretty much presumptively the Constitution is judicially enforceable, assuming that there's like somebody withstanding and there's like a real case. And so like if Congress didn't do what Brian and I are proposing and didn't pass a law, this is why I was saying there would still be litigation. I think you would still be able to tee up cases and the courts would be able to decide it. So in that sense, yes, it's self-executing, but there is a really important role for Congress to play in enacting legislation. And I do think it would make an enormous practical difference. And this is why, the hypotheticals we were talking about, the judge who has no law versus the judge who has a law, has a roadmap. I think those cases could come out really differently.
I also think counterintuitively that a congressional action, particularly one that had overwhelming support, might put downward pressure on the amount of litigation we end up seeing, insofar as if 70, 80, 90 senators are on record saying these people can't hold office again, what they're saying is that there's an expression within the country that these people are toxic and they shouldn't be in office. And so probably some asshole would try to run anyway, and then there might be litigation about that specific person. But it's just a way of expelling this virus from the body politic, and it might just work on its own to deter the people who participated in this and who the legislation would attach to from even bothering to try.
Is there a chance it makes? It's one quick question. Is there a chance it makes a martyr of those people, though? Like, is there that concern? Or, like, what are you guys thinking?
Martyrs.
There's going to be millions of people in the United States.
Yeah, but Trump becomes a martyr, and so
Trump's
Jr.
a martyr already.
On his father's martyrdom.
I gotta say, I'm not sure I mind that.
Yeah.
So if Ted Cruz or I mean, I don't, again, I have this, I don't know who's covered by this and who's not, but if Mo Brooks wants, gets a TV show as, the guy that the liberal elites in Congress don't want you to hear from, so they prescribed him like Lucius Cornelius Sulla, fine. Like, okay. Like, I'm not, lots of people have second acts. That's, Oliver North had a second act. And I don't think that's the worst thing in the world. I think
I would also just say as a general principle is, sorry, Ben, I didn't mean to interrupt. I think we might be on a little bit of a lag. I also think that now is an ideal time for all of us to rethink this idea that confronting this kind of element in our society will create a blowback that will make things worse. I mean, the Washington D.C. in general just kind of took an avoidance position on a lot of the bad things that we've seen happen beyond tweets and public statements, and we still ended up with an insurrection in the halls of Congress. Where 5 people died, and that I just think that alone is enough for us to say maybe we shouldn't try to predict the future about how politicians and society will react to righteous efforts to hold bad people accountable, and just try to do it, because not doing it doesn't seem to work very well. They still figure out a way to martyr themselves.
They've been martyred by Twitter this week without Congress doing anything to them. No, I agree with you. I think it's important that you do that Congress did the impeachment first, because that's a targeted thing about the president's conduct and the unacceptability of that from a presidential conduct point of view. I think this law will be hard to write well, but I agree with you. My gut is that the more you study, the more we learn about what happened, the more we're going to learn that there were certain people who were actively involved. I mean, there's one woman who frickin' tweeted the location of the Speaker of the House, right, in the middle of an emergency. That's a deliberate act. And there are people who are going to be shown to, and for all I know, Josh Hawley and Ted Cruz may be among those people. They're people who engaged in despicable activity in their capacity as legislators and tried to overturn an election and had some engagement with protesters, but had nothing to do with the invasion of the Capitol. And maybe that's not covered by this. But there are also some people who, and I, by the way, believe Donald Trump may have been one of them, who were doing stuff during this period, right? After he leaves and before they get cleared out, he's pretty radio silent. And I think Congress wants to know who he was in touch with. I think Congress should want to know, were there any intermediaries between the White House and the people who were inside? What was the relationship? And I think, if you could really find out a lot of that stuff, maybe you could write a statute that says people who materially participated in this in any of the following ways, bullet point, bullet point, bullet point, bullet point, and then leave courts to figure out who the record will apply, who the record does and does not stand up against that too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a Republican congressman who today issued his statement on voting no on impeachment, saying, I think future discoveries will make this vote look bad because we will learn that the president was more involved than we thought. Yeah. And they know, I mean, they're aware that this is worse than it looks, and it looks terrible.
Yeah. Yeah.
We are going to leave it there. So while we've been talking, we did a little poll of the readership of those viewing, saying, should Congress pass a law under Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, barring from office people who participated in the events of January 6th? 35 votes for yes, now up to 39, 40 as 43, as people notice the poll. 20 plus votes for only if it's very carefully written, no votes for no. So you have at least persuaded the In Lieu of Fun viewership.
Not biased, all
fist.
totally. We're Nate Silver over here, like very solid.
Yeah, this is a So tomorrow, folks, we have Claire Malone back by popular demand of the audience. Many of you have been asking for Claire to return. She will be back with us tomorrow. Deepak, Brian, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having us. Honored to
so
be here
fun
on
to talk to you
Impeachment Day.
guys.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming.
So do we know yet who the 4 Republicans were who didn't vote?
Mm-mm.
Those are the ones I'm really interested in.
Yeah, they gavelled closed just before we started, so I didn't have a chance to investigate.
Yeah,
I have one guess as to one of them, but that's it.
Well, we will explore their identities and out them. All of this will start 22 hours and 52 minutes from now. And until then, Kate?
We don't have fun anymore, but we do have an insurrection to investigate. I am eager to see things come home to roost on this, and I really hope that they do.
And I just want to say that yesterday's sign-off turned out to be incorrect, because about an hour after Kate said, "We don't have fun anymore, but I do have a vaccine appointment," she texted me that her vaccine appointment had been canceled. Yeah. So this only goes to show that you can't trust Kate's sign-offs on In Lieu of Fun. We will see you tomorrow.